Hey guys, tonight we begin with something special. A story not of battles or crowns, but of silence. The kind of silence that holds its breath in forgotten corners of history. Before we step into tonight's story, take a second to like this video and subscribe, so these mysteries can reach others in your family too. And in the comments, tell me your location and the exact time you're watching this. It's always fascinating to see where you're tuning in from, almost like tiny lights glowing on a map across the world, each of us connected in the stillness of night. It begins not with the shouting of wars nor the grand speeches of kings, but with silence, a silence thick enough to linger in the air of forgotten rooms. Rooms where the walls once trembled with the hum of machines and the muffled sobs of those who entered but never truly left. They are quiet now, emptied of their instruments, their tables covered in dust, but the air remembers. If you lean close enough to the peeling paint, if you listen in the stillness of the night, the whispers come. They tell of experiments once thought of as progress, born in the minds of men who believed themselves to be pioneers, yet acted as executioners cloaked in white coats. In these hidden laboratories, history does not march with banners or pageantry. Instead, it creeps in shadows, leaving behind stories no one wanted to speak aloud. Stories that slip between cracks in old hospital floors, stories that rattle inside locked cabinets. What was done here was not medicine, though they called it science. It was not healing, though they promised cures. It was curiosity without conscience, ambition without morality, cruelty disguised as discovery. Step into these places long abandoned, and the echoes still carry the weight of their secrets. Imagine the metallic tang that never left the air, the way fluorescent lights flickered against steel instruments, the way heavy doors shut with a sound that felt final. Patients, though the word feels dishonest, were brought inside not as individuals, but as specimens. Numbers in notebooks, subjects in cages of flesh and bone. They were told little, if anything. Consent was never part of the equation. What mattered was control, the ability to probe the body as if it were a puzzle, to push the limits of pain and endurance, and to see just how much suffering could be inflicted in the name of knowledge. These laboratories existed not on the edges of civilization, but at its very heart. Universities, military facilities, hospitals, and research centres, places people trusted, became silent chambers of torment. And though decades have passed, the whispers have not gone away. They cling to history's margins, waiting for someone willing to sit with them in the dark, waiting for someone who will not turn away when the ugliness becomes unbearable. The first whispers belong to the world of the 19th century, an era of progress and invention, but also of arrogance. Medicine was shedding superstition, stepping boldly into a future of vaccines, surgeries, and public health. Yet for every advancement that saved lives, there were doors locked to outsiders, where human beings were stripped of their humanity and turned into experiments. In those quiet wards, poorhouses and asylums became feeding grounds for physicians who sought answers but lacked patience for ethics. The forgotten laboratories thrived where society looked least, among the poor, the imprisoned, the insane. A woman in a psychiatric ward, her cries dismissed as madness, might find herself strapped to a chair, her veins opened to test the limits of blood loss. A child born to a family too poor to resist might be taken into a hospital under the guise of treatment, only to be used as a vessel for strange new chemicals. A prisoner might be told his punishment was not confinement, but service to science, his body a canvas upon which experiments could be written. These lives vanished into records, carefully inked in ledgers that spoke of results, but never of pain. The laboratories whispered also in wartime, when desperation gave men permission to abandon morality altogether. Wars, after all, are fertile grounds for experiments, cloaked beneath the urgency of survival. Soldiers were not just fighters, they were test subjects. On battlefields where gunfire raged above, below the surface syringes pierced veins to measure how much gas a body could endure, how long before the lungs collapsed, how quickly the heart surrendered. The laboratories wanted answers. And in war, no answer was too cruel to pursue. But cruelty did not end when peace was declared. The whispers continued into the 20th century, louder, sharper, harder to ignore. Laboratories expanded, equipped with new machines, new chemicals, new ambitions. Scientists dreamed of reshaping humanity, of unlocking secrets hidden in cells and blood. And in their hunger, they trampled the very humanity they sought to understand. The rooms grew brighter with fluorescent light, colder with steel tables, but the atmosphere remained the same, a place where suffering was method, where screams were data. Walk down the corridors in your imagination, and you may see the outlines of what once was. Beds bolted to the ground, patients restrained not to heal, but to endure. Cabinets full of glass vials. Their labels faded now, but once marked with strange codes. Mixtures brewed to test how much the human body could withstand before it broke. Notebooks filled with sketches of organs, pages detailing fevers, rashes, and seizures, each entry a person reduced to observation. The whisper comes not only from the walls, but from the words themselves, the cold, clinical descriptions of pain, recorded without remorse. It is tempting to believe these laboratories were aberrations, isolated places run by a few monstrous individuals. Yet the whispers tell otherwise. They speak of systems, not just men. Governments funded them, universities defended them, doctors justified them, newspapers ignored them, communities turned away. These laboratories were not hidden because no one knew. They were hidden because no one wanted to know. To acknowledge them would mean confronting the uncomfortable truth that cruelty was not confined to the shadows of history, but embedded in the very structures meant to protect us. Still, the laboratories whispered, sometimes louder than those who tried to silence them. Survivors carried their scars into the world, even if their words were often dismissed. A child who once lay beneath surgical lamps remembered the weight of restraints. A soldier returned from war with lungs scarred not by enemy fire, but by the gases his own government tested on him. An orphan, once told she was receiving treatment, lived long enough to see the lies exposed. These voices cracked through the silence, fragile but unyielding. They reminded us that behind every statistic was a human being who suffered, who endured, and whose story deserved to be remembered. But memory is a fragile thing. The laboratories are quiet now, most of them dismantled or abandoned, their walls reclaimed by dust and silence. Yet forgetting does not erase what was done. Forgetting allows the whispers to grow louder, until they shape nightmares that will not let the world rest. To step into these stories is to understand that history is not only kings and battles, but also the quiet rooms where science lost its soul. As the night deepens, the whispers grow closer, as though the laboratories themselves are reaching out across time, refusing to be erased. They remind us that beneath the sterile language of reports and studies lies a darkness that is human-made. They remind us that progress, when severed from conscience, is not progress at all. It is cruelty draped in the disguise of discovery. And so, as you drift deeper into this story, let the silence of those laboratories settle around you. Let it be a reminder that history is not just about what was achieved, but also about what was endured. The whisper is faint, but it is there, waiting for anyone willing to listen. It is the beginning of a journey into the darkest corners of human ambition, where science and cruelty became indistinguishable, and where the true cost of discovery was measured in broken bodies and stolen lives. The laboratories are gone, but their echoes remain. And if you lean close enough, you can still hear them, soft as a breath, relentless as the past itself. There is a peculiar comfort people place in hospitals. White walls, the scent of disinfectant, the presence of doctors and nurses in clean uniforms, all of it builds the illusion of safety. We walk through their doors believing that within lies healing, that the sick will be cared for, that pain will be eased. But there were doors once, doors heavy with iron hinges and frosted glass, behind which the air was colder, not warmer. The corridors led not to comfort, but to silence, and the silence was not peaceful, it was suffocating. These were the places where healing was only a pretense, where human lives became fodder for experiments few outside dared to imagine. The hospitals of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were not the temples of health we picture today. They were, in many ways, convenient hiding places. Beneath the glow of progress and the promise of science, they concealed rooms where the most vulnerable were left at the mercy of men who wore their authority like armour. Behind the closed doors of certain wards, experiments unfolded not with consent, but with coercion, not with kindness, but with cold calculation. Patients entered seeking relief, yet many were instead offered as sacrifices to curiosity masquerading as discovery. It was easy for these things to remain hidden. Hospitals were already spaces of secrecy. Sickness itself was private, and families rarely questioned the details of treatment when cloaked in medical language. A doctor's word carried the weight of truth, even when that truth was stitched together with lies. Consent forms did not exist as we know them today. A patient's silence, or even their inability to protest, was often taken as agreement. And for those confined to asylums or indigent wards, their voices were dismissed before they were ever heard. The shadows gathered most thickly around those who had no power. The poor, the mentally ill, orphans, prisoners, these were the bodies most often chosen. Their suffering was written off as acceptable loss. An inmate with a cough could be given an untested chemical and told it was medicine, though the effects would burn through his body like fire. A woman suffering from melancholy might be subjected to electric shocks, not for her health, but for the notes it produced in a doctor's ledger. A child born with a disability could be operated on repeatedly, not to save them, but to sharpen the surgeon's skill. In every case, the justification was the same: the pursuit of knowledge, the greater good, the advancement of medicine. Hospitals became laboratories disguised as sanctuaries. One wing might indeed serve the sick, with nurses tending gently to fevers, while another wing, perhaps locked, perhaps tucked behind unmarked doors, housed experiments that would never be spoken of in public. Records were carefully phrased, words like observation and treatment, concealing what was, in truth, testing. The line between doctor and tormentor blurred until the distinction vanished. There are accounts, half buried in archives, of patients whose illnesses were deliberately prolonged so that doctors could study the stages of disease. Tuberculosis, syphilis, and smallpox were not only treated, but sometimes allowed to fester, just to watch their course. Instead of helping, doctors recorded. Instead of curing, they documented. To them, each shiver, each lesion, each decline was a valuable note in the symphony of their research. The patient's body was the instrument, their suffering, the music. And yet, the cruelty did not always wear the mask of detachment. Sometimes it revealed itself in ambition too eager to pause. Surgeries were performed without anesthesia, not because it was unavailable, but because doctors wanted to observe pain itself, how the body contorted, how the pulse raced, how much could be endured before consciousness collapsed. Children were especially vulnerable, their small bodies considered resilient test cases for procedures adults might not survive. Their cries, muffled behind the hospital doors, were dismissed as unfortunate necessities of progress. The shadows deepened further when hospitals became entwined with institutions of power. Military hospitals, for instance, offered both cover and opportunity. Soldiers, conditioned to obey, were often tested upon in the name of national security. They were told little, if anything, and their injuries or deaths could be dismissed as casualties of war. In civilian hospitals, funding from governments or universities encouraged bold experimentation. Physicians knew they could pursue dangerous studies without fear of repercussion, shielded by prestige and bureaucracy. Consider the forgotten stories of early radiation research. Hospitals were among the first to adopt the new technology of X-rays, but caution was not their strong suit. Patients were exposed repeatedly, sometimes intentionally overdosed to see the effects. Burns, sores, cancers, all were carefully noted, their victims treated as little more than numbers. Doctors themselves often succumbed to the same fate, their hands blackened by repeated exposure. But unlike their patients, they chose their risks. The poor souls strapped to tables did not. Then came the age of injections. The syringe, once a simple tool of relief, became a weapon in the pursuit of experiments. Behind closed doors, patients were injected with unknown substances, dyes to trace their circulation, chemicals to test toxicity, pathogens to observe infection. Sometimes they were told it was medicine. Sometimes they were told nothing at all. Their bodies betrayed them quickly, fevers rising, organs failing, mind slipping into delirium. Notes were taken, vials stored, but the patient was little more than an entry in a study that would later be published with pride. The most disturbing element was not the secrecy, nor even the cruelty, but the indifference. For the doctors and nurses involved, these acts did not feel like crimes. They were work, routine, another entry in the long hours of a hospital day. A patient screaming from shock therapy was not a tragedy, it was data. A prisoner's skin blistering from chemical exposure was not a horror, it was progress. The language of medicine insulated them from the reality of what they were doing. Pain became response, death became outcome. Outside the walls, life went on. Families trusted the doctors, communities supported the hospitals, governments funded the research. Few asked questions, and those who did were given answers wrapped in authority. To challenge a physician was to challenge science itself, and most people lacked the courage or the knowledge to do so. Thus the shadows remained intact, growing thicker with each passing year, each unchallenged act, each experiment hidden in plain sight. Yet whispers still escaped. Survivors sometimes spoke, though their words were rarely believed. Who would listen to a patient deemed insane, or a prisoner already condemned, or a child too young to articulate? Their testimonies drifted through history like faint signals, warnings of the cruelty that lay behind hospital doors. Some were recorded in diaries, others in letters, and a few in official inquiries when scandals became too large to ignore. But most were lost, drowned beneath the tide of medical progress, celebrated by those who preferred not to see the suffering beneath it. And so, hospitals became paradoxes. Places where life was saved in one room and stolen in another, where kindness coexisted with cruelty, where healing hands shared corridors with hands that inflicted wounds in the name of knowledge. To walk those halls was to tread between light and shadow, never knowing which door led to comfort and which to torment. The echoes of those places linger still. The scent of antiseptic, the gleam of steel, the quiet footsteps in long corridors. They carry with them the weight of history, a reminder that progress is not always pure. For behind the closed hospital doors of the past, humanity learned lessons not of compassion, but of how easily it can abandon compassion altogether. The whispers that slip through the cracks of memory urge us not to forget. They warn us that even in the places we trust most, shadows can gather, waiting only for silence to conceal them. And in that silence, history breathes, reminding us that the walls of hospitals have heard not only prayers for healing, but screams that were never meant to be heard at all. The air inside those institutions was not merely heavy with disinfectant, or the metallic sting of instruments. It was heavy with calculation. Behind the doors where hope and fear mingled, another current flowed, an obsession with precision, with numbers, with evidence that cared nothing for the beating hearts beneath it. The hands that held the instruments were steady, but they were cold. They moved with an elegance stripped of feeling, guided not by compassion, but by curiosity sharpened into cruelty. It was the kind of touch that belonged to science when it no longer needed mercy. Human beings, stripped of their stories, were reduced to samples of flesh and bone, their bodies segmented into organs, their minds into reflexes, their lives into variables. The pulse in their veins was measured, the tremors in their muscles recorded, the collapse of their lungs noted in tidy handwriting. To those who conducted the experiments, the body was nothing more than a system to manipulate, a puzzle to pull apart piece by piece. Pain was not a tragedy, it was a measurement. Death was not a loss, it was a conclusion. The coldness did not arrive suddenly. It crept in, disguised as dedication, cloaked in the pursuit of discovery. Physicians trained to detach from suffering learned to harden themselves, and soon the detachment became hunger. A patient's panic before a procedure, their pleading eyes, their trembling hands, these were not interruptions but data points, signs of resistance to be observed. The colder the hand, the steadier the needle, and the steadier the needle, the more precise the result. Some experiments sought to unravel endurance. How long could the body survive without food, without water, without sleep? Behind barred windows, patients were watched night after night as exhaustion gnawed away at them, their minds slipping into delirium, their bodies convulsing in weakness. Doctors did not intervene, they recorded. They studied the gradual deterioration as if it were a clock winding down, curious to see at what precise hour and minute life would give way to silence. Other trials delved into the limits of pain. Limbs were cut, nerves exposed, chemicals dripped onto raw wounds. The patients screamed until their voices gave out, and then their silence was noted with the same calm as the onset of fever. Some were subjected to repeated surgeries, their bodies stitched and unstitched like garments, their resilience tested not for healing, but for endurance. The scientists stood over them, hands folded, voices steady, eyes gleaming with the reflection of scalpels. It was not only the body that was measured, the mind too was a canvas for cruelty. Patients were deprived of light, confined to silence for days or weeks, their thoughts unravelling in the isolation. Others were flooded with overstimulation, bright lights, piercing sounds, shocks to the skin. Their responses were tracked with clinical precision. The moment fear appeared in their eyes, the second they began to hallucinate, the exact point where their minds fractured under pressure. The language of the records concealed the reality. The notes spoke of psychological thresholds and neurological responses. But what those words truly meant was the sight of a human being breaking, their spirit crushed beneath relentless observation. The ink on the pages was cool, neat, detached, just like the hands that orchestrated the suffering. The hospitals, the laboratories, the institutions, all shared this chilling current. The touch of science without mercy was not confined to one place or one time. It appeared wherever curiosity outran conscience, wherever authority silenced resistance, wherever the vulnerable could be cornered and stripped of their humanity. And it was justified with the same refrain that progress required sacrifice, that knowledge demanded suffering, that the end excused the means, but the end was rarely salvation for the subjects. The end was often a shallow grave, or a nameless entry in a ledger, or a body discarded when it no longer served its purpose. These human beings did not live to see the discoveries they were sacrificed for, and even when those discoveries advanced medicine, the cost was written in pain that could never be repaid. Some of the most chilling accounts describe the experiments with temperature, where scientists sought to understand the boundaries of human survival. Subjects were plunged into freezing water, their bodies shivering violently as their temperatures dropped, their skin turning blue, their breath ragged and shallow. Doctors stood with stopwatches, measuring the rate at which the body succumbed to cold, noting how long it took for consciousness to fade, how long before the heart stopped. Others were exposed to searing heat, confined in chambers where the air burned the lungs, their skin blistering as they collapsed on the floor. The precision of the data was praised. The suffering of the subjects was ignored. There were also experiments with poisons, substances slipped into food or injected into veins. Some were slow, their effects crawling through the body over hours, days, even weeks. Others were swift, paralyzing muscles, suffocating lungs, stilling the heart in minutes. The cold touch of science was steady in these moments, watching the progression of agony with the same patience as one might watch the unfolding of a natural phenomenon. What strikes hardest, when one lingers in these histories, is not only what was done, but the manner in which it was done. The cruelty was not fiery, not born of rage or hatred. It was methodical. The hand that tightened the strap, the hand that turned the valve, the hand that wrote the note in the ledger, none of these trembled. None of these belonged to a sadist revelling in screams. They belonged to men and women who believed themselves to be seekers of truth. Theirs was not the cruelty of passion, but of indifference, the most chilling kind. And so, the cold touch spread, reaching across borders and decades. It found its place in psychiatric wards, in military facilities, in orphanages and prisons. Each institution offered a new set of subjects, a new stage for experiments. The vulnerable, the voiceless, the forgotten. They bore the weight of curiosity unbound by conscience. The echoes of these experiments linger not just in memory, but in medicine itself. Many procedures and practices we take for granted today rest on foundations built with the suffering of those who never consented. Vaccines, surgical techniques, psychiatric understandings, all carry shadows of the past, shadows that remind us of the cost at which knowledge was gained. It is a cost few are willing to confront openly, but it cannot be erased. As night deepens, the image grows clearer. A room too bright under artificial light, the sterile gleam of steel, the figure of a doctor leaning over a restrained body, instruments glinting in his hand. His voice is calm, his movements precise, his notes meticulous. There is no anger in him, no malice, but there is no mercy either. Only the pursuit of knowledge, steady and unrelenting, as the patient beneath him trembles, pleads, breaks. This is the cold touch of science, a touch that advances without compassion, a touch that reduces humanity to nothing more than an experiment. The silence that follows is not the silence of peace, but of emptiness. The body stills, The instruments are cleaned. The notes are filed away. The doctor moves on to the next subject, the next measurement, the next variable. The work continues, the cold touch reaching out again and again, across countless lives. And in the darkness beyond those hospital walls, history listens, holding on to the memory of each hand that touched without mercy, each experiment that stole without remorse. The coldness remains, not in the rooms themselves, for many have been abandoned or demolished, but in the legacy they left behind. It whispers in the margins of medical texts, in the footnotes of history, in the quiet acknowledgement that progress was purchased at a price too cruel to forget. And as the story unfolds further, those whispers grow heavier, pressing against the silence of the night, reminding us that once science set aside mercy, it was capable of anything. War has always been a theatre of destruction, but its shadows extend further than the battlefield. Beyond the thunder of artillery and the roar of planes, there is a quieter, more insidious war waged in hidden chambers. The kind of war fought not with rifles but with syringes, not with bombs but with scalpels, not upon enemies in uniform, but upon those who could not resist. While soldiers marched above ground, beneath the veil of secrecy, experiments unfolded that would leave no monuments, no medals, only whispers carried by the silence that follows when cruelty is too great to name aloud. Conflict provides cover. It offers justification. In wartime, the rules bend and morality collapses under the weight of urgency. Leaders speak of survival, of strategy, of sacrifice. And in this climate, doctors and scientists find a stage where their ambitions can masquerade as patriotism. What might be condemned in peace is permitted in war, even celebrated, so long as it promises advantage. Laboratories expand, permissions loosen, human bodies become expendable material in the pursuit of knowledge that might tip the balance of power. The war hospitals and camps of the 20th century carried this silence most heavily. In unmarked rooms, men in coats gathered not around wounded soldiers to heal them, but around captives to dissect their endurance. Prisoners of war, civilians caught in occupation, even the soldiers themselves. None were safe from the hands that turned them into experiments. The justifications were endless. To develop treatments for frostbite, to test the limits of dehydration, to prepare for chemical attacks. But beneath the language of necessity lay the same cold curiosity that had haunted laboratories long before. War simply gave it freedom. Imagine the scene. A group of prisoners herded into a chamber, told they are to be tested for survival in extreme cold. They are stripped, doused in icy water, left to shiver while doctors record the decline of their vital signs. Some collapse quickly, their bodies unable to resist the freezing grip, while others linger, trembling, gasping, their eyes wide with the terror of knowing they are being watched not as humans but as data. Outside, the world rages with tanks and gunfire, but inside, the silence is broken only by the scratching of pens against paper. Elsewhere, in sealed rooms, gases are released into the air. The subjects cough, choke, claw at their throats. Their bodies convulse, their lungs fight for air, but there is no escape. The purpose, they are told, is to understand chemical warfare, to prepare antidotes. Yet no antidotes are offered. The victims collapse one after another, their final moments reduced to numbers on a chart. The doctors stand with masks over their faces, untouched, recording every spasm, every desperate breath. The silence that follows their deaths is not mournful. It is efficient, orderly, a silence that allows the experiment to move on to the next round. War turned entire populations into test subjects. Occupied towns became laboratories, their citizens summoned in the name of health checks or vaccinations, only to receive injections of substances that burn through their veins with unknown poisons. Pregnant women were monitored as they were exposed to chemicals or radiation, their unborn children observed like curiosities to see what deformities might emerge. These mothers were not patients. They were vessels for experiments that asked questions too horrific to be voiced outside those walls. The silence was not accidental. It was constructed. Soldiers were ordered to guard facilities, preventing outsiders from ever seeing the horrors inside. Records were kept in coded language, cloaked with terms like study and field trial. Survivors who spoke risked being silenced permanently, their testimonies buried alongside their bodies. Even after the wars ended, the secrets were protected, files destroyed, names erased, witnesses dismissed. The experiments lived only in fragments, whispered in testimonies decades later, often ignored because the full truth was too heavy to bear. The cruelty was not confined to one nation, nor to one war. Across continents, during both world wars and beyond, governments sanctioned experiments they would later deny. In the name of survival, in the name of victory, they gave permission to inflict suffering upon the vulnerable. Some chose prisoners of war, stripped of rights the moment they were captured. Others turned to their own soldiers, young men conscripted into service who obeyed orders without realizing those orders made them test subjects. And still others looked to civilians, entire communities treated as expendable in the calculations of war. Among the most chilling accounts are those of experiments with disease. War made illness a weapon, and doctors sought to understand how far it could be spread, how quickly it could kill, how best it could be contained. Prisoners were deliberately infected with typhus, cholera, plague, diseases that ravaged their bodies while doctors observed from a safe distance. Vaccines were tested without consent, their failures killing as many as the diseases themselves. The subjects wasted away in fever and agony, their suffering dismissed as necessary sacrifice for the knowledge gained. The silence of wartime experiments lingers even more darkly, because it was often rewarded. Those who carried out the cruelties were not punished when the war ended. Many were absorbed into new institutions, their data considered too valuable to discard. Files filled with notes on suffering were carried across borders, shared between allies and former enemies alike. Instead of being condemned, the architects of cruelty were offered positions, their expertise prized more than the lives they had taken. The silence protected them, and in protecting them, it preserved the legacy of their experiments. What makes these secrets so haunting is not only their cruelty, but the realization that they were hidden in plain sight. Soldiers who guarded the buildings must have known the screams were not of healing, but of torment. Nurses who carried supplies into locked wards must have felt the wrongness in their steps. Officers who signed the orders must have recognized the weight of their decisions. Yet they all participated in the silence, each layer of secrecy ensuring that the truth would not escape. Even decades later, when fragments of the truth began to surface, the silence clung stubbornly. Governments denied. Institutions withheld documents. Survivors were doubted. Their testimonies questioned. History prefers victories, not confessions. And so the experiments remain buried beneath the official narratives of wartime heroism, their victims left unnamed, their suffering unacknowledged. But silence does not erase. It lingers like a fog, seeping into the memory of places, clinging to the walls of abandoned camps, echoing in the testimonies of those who lived just long enough to speak. At night, one can almost hear it, the faint sound of boots in corridors, the scrape of metal against stone, the muffled cries cut short by doors closing too firmly. It is a silence that is not empty but heavy, depressing, suffused with the weight of secrets never fully told. History often chooses to look at wars through the lens of battles and treaties, generals and leaders. But in the margins of those grand narratives, hidden behind the silence of wartime, are stories that erode faith in humanity. They remind us that cruelty does not only erupt in the chaos of combat, but can thrive in the calm precision of laboratories, in the steady hand of a doctor who writes as his patient dies, in the quiet rooms where suffering is calculated rather than relieved. These are the secrets buried in wartime silence, not forgotten, not gone, but waiting. Waiting in archives locked away, in testimonies half believed, in ruins scattered across fields where the grass grows too quickly over what lies beneath. And as long as the silence remains, the whispers will continue, reminding us that the horrors of war are not only fought with weapons, but also with experiments that stripped human beings of their dignity, their identity, and ultimately their lives. The needle is a deceptively simple instrument. Slender, sharp, easily hidden in the palm of a hand, it has the power to both heal and destroy. In the hands of the merciful, it delivers medicine, stitching life back into fragile bodies. In the hands of the ambitious, it becomes something else entirely. A key to hidden chambers of human suffering, a weapon of quiet precision, a tool through which science stretched its fingers into the deepest recesses of flesh and blood. And when men began to see themselves not as doctors, but as gods, the needle became their scepter. Needles carried the promise of progress. With them, chemicals could enter the bloodstream directly, bypassing the body's defences. Vaccines, anaesthetics, treatments, all owed their existence to this humble tool. But for those consumed by the hunger for discovery, each injection was also a chance to push boundaries, to test what veins and organs could endure, to see how much poison could be tolerated, how far the human body could be bent before it finally broke. The prick of metal was small, but what followed was often a storm. Behind closed doors, subjects sat in rows, arms outstretched, sleeves rolled up, not by choice, but by command. The glint of the needle was the last familiar thing they saw before their lives were drawn into experiments they could neither escape nor comprehend. Some were injected with diseases, malaria, syphilis, typhoid, deliberately introduced to observe the slow crawl of infection. The scientists watched with pens ready, noting the fevers, the rashes, the tremors, the deaths. These were not cures in the making. They were performances of suffering, staged again and again for the sake of data. Others were injected with chemicals whose names they did not know, substances tested for toxicity, for endurance, for efficiency. Some burned like fire, coursing through veins until the body convulsed. Others numbed the senses, leaving victims adrift in half-consciousness, their breaths shallow, their eyes unfocused. Some agents killed slowly, eroding the organs over weeks, while others struck swiftly, silencing the heart in moments. Each outcome was logged with the detachment of a laboratory study, though the setting was often a prison, an asylum, or a ward of unwanted patients. The men who held the needles often justified themselves with words like necessity and progress. To them, each injection was an offering to the altar of science. Yet there was something unmistakably godlike in the way they wielded power, the ability to dictate suffering or relief, life or death, with a single push of the plunger. It was not simply research. It was dominion. The subjects were stripped of agency, reduced to vessels carrying the results that scientists desired. In some cases, the injections were designed not to harm, but to experiment with healing under cruel circumstances. Soldiers were given experimental vaccines, untested serums rushed into their veins before anyone knew if they worked. Some survived, protected from disease. Others writhed in agony, their bodies rejecting the foreign mixtures, their blood poisoned by treatments that were supposed to save. The failures were quietly buried, while the data was preserved, celebrated, and studied. The suffering of those who died was rarely mentioned, erased beneath the triumph of progress. There are accounts, buried in archives, of experiments with repeated injections, needles piercing the same arms day after day until the veins collapsed, until the flesh grew hard and swollen, until infection set in. Some subjects were injected with multiple substances at once, cocktails of chemicals designed to test combinations. The results were catastrophic, organs shutting down, fevers soaring, minds unravelling in delirium. Yet for the men who played God, these were not tragedies but revelations. Each convulsion was a clue, each death a piece of knowledge to be filed away. What makes these stories more chilling is the indifference with which they were carried out. The scientists did not always revel in cruelty. Many simply worked with the detachment of men who believed they were serving a higher purpose. The scream of a subject was not a plea, it was a reaction, something to be measured. The collapse of a body was not a loss, it was an end point, one more line in a report. Their hands did not tremble as they pierced skin because they believed themselves above the trembling of ordinary men. Needles became instruments not only of experimentation, but of control. In hospitals, injections were administered under the guise of treatment. Patients told they were receiving medicine, when in truth they were being tested. In prisons, injections replaced punishments. The body itself transformed into a site of experimentation. In camps, the needle was a weapon of silence. Those injected rarely lived to speak of what was done to them. Each puncture of skin carried with it the weight of domination, of one person deciding the fate of another with nothing more than a flick of the wrist. The godlike nature of these men was not in their greatness, but in their arrogance. They believed themselves capable of reshaping humanity, of bending biology to their will. With needles, they sought to create immunity, to engineer resistance, even to alter behaviour. Some experiments injected hormones, attempting to control growth, fertility, or temperament. Others tested narcotics, pushing doses to extremes to observe dependence and withdrawal. Human beings became test tubes, their veins the laboratory, their lives the cost of curiosity unbound. The quiet horror of these experiments lies in their invisibility. Unlike the roar of bombs or the clash of armies, the needle leaves only a small mark, a bruise that fades, a wound so slight it could be mistaken for routine care. Yet within that tiny puncture flowed the potential for agony, disfigurement, death. The silence of the needle was its greatest weapon. It allowed cruelty to masquerade as medicine, suffering to be disguised as treatment. Even today, echoes of those experiments linger. Some of the knowledge gained was absorbed into medicine, stripped of its origins, repurposed for healing. Vaccines refined, treatments improved, techniques perfected. Yet beneath every success lies the shadow of the suffering that made it possible. The men who played God with needles left behind a legacy not only of progress but of pain, a reminder that science, when divorced from mercy, becomes indistinguishable from cruelty. The silence around these experiments remains heavy, not because they are forgotten, but because they are uncomfortable to remember. To confront them is to acknowledge that the tools we trust most, the syringe that delivers a vaccine, the injection that relieves pain, carry with them a history steeped in torment. The trust between doctor and patient, so sacred today, was once betrayed again and again by those who wielded needles not to heal, but to harm. As night lingers and the mind drifts deeper into the corridors of memory, The image becomes clear. Rows of subjects seated with arms bared, the glint of metal in dim light, the steady hands of men who believe themselves untouchable. The needle slides into skin, the plunger descends, the body convulses, the pen scratches in a notebook. Outside, the world carries on unaware. Inside, beneath the silence, men play God. And when the last subject falls still, the needles are cleaned, the vials refilled, the records filed away. Tomorrow will bring another line of arms, another round of injections, another series of lives reduced to data. The cycle continues, unbroken, until the silence of history swallows the screams. And within that silence, the memory lingers, sharp as the point of a needle, cold as the hands that wielded it, eternal as the arrogance of those who believed they could decide the boundaries of suffering. The cold has always been a ruthless teacher. It strips away illusion, paring life down to its most fragile essence. In the tundra, there is no softness, no comfort, only the bite of wind, the unyielding silence, and the knowledge that the body is never far from surrender. For centuries, humans learned to respect the cold, to fear it, to endure it with fire and shelter. But there were others who saw in the ice a stage, a place where human resilience could be tested, measured, and broken. In the hands of those who sought dominion over both nature and flesh, the frozen tundra became a laboratory without walls. The whisper of wind across the snow was the only witness, as men were led into chambers chilled to mimic the brutal nights of the Arctic. Some were stripped bare, their skin left to the mercy of the frost. The experimenters watched not with pity, but with anticipation, notebooks open, eyes fixed on the trembling of muscles, the whitening of fingers, the moment when shivers gave way to stillness. Hypothermia, once a slow hunter of the lost traveller, was summoned into rooms and measured in degrees and minutes. Each breath of vapour became data, each collapse a conclusion. Frostbite was no longer an accident of the wilderness, but a phenomenon to be studied with precision. Subjects' limbs were submerged in icy water, or pressed against frozen metal until skin adhered, until blisters rose and tissue blackened. The progression was recorded with clinical fascination, the stiffening of joints, the creeping numbness, the spread of necrosis. Some limbs were thawed and refrozen, again and again, as if the body were no more than an experiment in resilience. For the men with pens, the agony was a detail. For the men with frozen hands, it was the end of sensation, the erasure of self. The tundra offered another kind of cruelty, starvation in the cold. Subjects were denied food and warmth simultaneously, their bodies forced to fight on two fronts. Metabolism, once a hidden rhythm, became a spectacle as muscles consumed themselves for fuel. Scientists noted how long a man could march through snow before his legs buckled, how many hours he could survive with lungs filled by air so sharp it cut like glass. Each collapse was charted not as tragedy, but as discovery, knowledge carved into the margins of notebooks by men who stood shrouded in coats, while those they studied shivered naked before them. What made the frozen experiment so harrowing was the illusion of nature's neutrality. The cold was not a weapon forged by man, yet here it was sharpened, harnessed, turned against the very creatures it once threatened equally. The scientists positioned themselves as observers of natural law, but in truth, they had become its orchestrators. They summoned winter at will, creating artificial tundras where suffering could be repeated endlessly, without the unpredictability of chance. The ice no longer belonged to the wilderness, it belonged to the laboratory. In these experiments, survival was not always the goal. Sometimes the purpose was endurance, to know how long a man could function in sub-zero air. how long a pilot might last if shot down in icy seas, how long an army could march before frost hollowed it from within. The subjects did not know they were answers to questions asked in languages of strategy and war. They only knew the cold, a cold that settled deep into the marrow, that stole memory and thought, that made even pain too distant to hold. There are stories of men forced into tanks of freezing water, their bodies held under watch until consciousness slipped away. Some were revived in cruel ways, subjected to boiling baths that scalded already fragile skin, or pressed against the warmth of other bodies used like tools. The scientists measured not only the death, but the return, charting how the body might be brought back from the brink, how far it could be pushed into the abyss before it was irretrievable. In their hands, even revival was not mercy. It was another test, another calculation. The tundra whispers because it remembers. Snow carries sound differently. Voices vanish into the air, as though swallowed by the frozen earth. And so too did the voices of those who endured these experiments vanish, silenced not only by death, but by the indifference of history. Their names were rarely recorded, their stories left untold. What remains are numbers. Hours survived, temperatures endured, organs destroyed. Numbers that erase the faces, the trembling hands, the final exhalations that turn to mist before dissolving into nothingness. And yet, the legacy of those experiments lingers in ways most would not expect. Techniques for treating hypothermia, for reviving the frozen, for understanding the limits of endurance. These advancements trace their roots back to suffering carved into the tundra's silence. The line between knowledge and cruelty blurs when progress is built upon pain. The warmth of blankets and the safety of protocols used today hide within them the shadows of experiments where warmth was denied, where safety was never offered. The men who conducted these trials did not see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as pioneers in a landscape where science and war demanded answers. To them, the frozen bodies were not human beings but variables, test subjects in equations designed to secure dominance. In their eyes, the cold was a challenge, and human life was merely the cost of solving it. They heard not the whispers of the tundra, but the applause of imagined victories, the march of armies that might one day benefit from the data gathered in silence. Yet the tundra keeps its own records. Every breath that froze in the air, every hand that blackened with frostbite, every heartbeat slowed to stillness, all of it lingers, unforgotten by the land that witnessed it. The snow holds memory differently than paper, not in words or numbers, but in silence, in the way wind curls through abandoned places, in the chill that still creeps into bones at the thought of it. The cold itself seems to remember what men tried to hide, and so the whispers persist, not loud enough to disturb the living, but soft enough to unsettle the night. They are the echoes of subjects who sat trembling in ice, who felt warmth slip away from their fingers, who gasped for breath as frost filled their lungs. They whisper of needles filled with saline, of vats of icy water, of frost-bitten skin peeled away in the name of study. They whisper of scientists in thick coats, pens scratching, eyes unblinking, as the cold claimed its unwilling disciples. It is not the silence of the tundra that lingers, but the whispers of those who endured it. Whispers that slip into dreams, that turn history into unease, that remind us the cold is not just a force of nature, but a weapon when placed in human hands. For while the wind carries away sound, it cannot erase memory. The tundra has seen too much, held too many bodies, heard too many final breaths to ever be truly silent. And when the night deepens and the air grows colder, the whispers return, carried by the same wind that once cut across the frozen experiments. They tell us that the men who studied endurance believed they had mastered the cold. But in truth, the cold mastered them all, leaving behind only silence, frost, and the haunting reminder that progress born from suffering never fully thaws. Islands have always carried an air of separation. Surrounded by water, cut off from the rhythm of the mainland, they exist in uneasy isolation, places where the rules of the larger world seem distant, blurred, or suspended. Throughout history, islands have been sanctuaries for some, prisons for others, and laboratories for those who saw their distance not as remoteness but as opportunity. When cruelty needed silence, when experiments required concealment, the island offered a stage. It was here, behind waves and horizons, that men decided to reshape humanity itself. The island was a place where those considered undesirable, prisoners, the poor, the sick, and the forgotten, were gathered under the guise of treatment or control. Yet the truth was simpler and darker. Away from the watchful eyes of society, human beings became resources, their lives spent like currency in experiments that blurred the lines between medicine and monstrosity. The sea kept secrets well. Ships ferried the unwanted to shorelines marked not by welcome, but by gates, high fences, and buildings that bore the false promise of hospitals. The air was heavy with salt and silence, broken only by the cries that drifted from inside stone walls. For those who lived there, escape was not possible. The water itself was a second barrier, ensuring that whatever was done within the island's confines remained trapped there. The experiments conducted on these islands took many forms. Some were cloaked in the language of public health. Vaccines, untested and unstable, were administered in mass trials. Needles pierced the arms of children, women, and men whose consent was neither sought nor required. Fevers rose, rashes spread, lungs filled with infection. The doctors recorded outcomes with detached precision, unconcerned with the suffering their formulas unleashed. The island became a proving ground where entire communities were reduced to subjects in a vast and ongoing trial. Others were framed as treatments for mental illness. Patients were subjected to electric shocks that left their bodies jerking, their tongues bitten, their memories shattered. Some were forced into chemical sedation, injected with compounds that dulled thought and will, leaving them docile, shadows of themselves. In other wings, invasive surgeries carved away parts of the brain in search of a cure that never came. The island, cut off from the world, became a workshop of silence, where cries echoed against stone and vanished into sea air. But not all experiments wore the mask of healing. Some were openly cruel, exercises in dominance disguised as research. Infectious diseases were introduced deliberately into the population. Water supplies were tampered with. Food was withheld or laced with substances designed to weaken the body. Entire wards were watched as though they were cages, every cough, every shiver, every collapse meticulously noted. These were not trials for the benefit of science. They were rehearsals in control, demonstrations of how fragile humanity becomes when stripped of freedom, nourishment, and dignity. The island setting added another layer of horror. Unlike the laboratories hidden in cities, these places bore no chance of rescue, no witnesses to stumble upon the suffering. The ocean was a collaborator, ensuring isolation. Those brought here were erased from the mainland, their names rarely recorded, their bodies often buried in unmarked graves, along windswept cliffs, or beneath the roots of twisted trees. Waves washed the shore clean, but beneath the earth the silence grew heavy, weighted with countless lives, consumed in the name of progress. There are accounts of children raised entirely within the island's confines, their lives engineered as long experiments. Some were denied education, their development observed in a cruel parody of curiosity. Others were separated from families, shuffled between wards as variables in unseen studies. They grew up not knowing the freedom of the world beyond water, only the narrow corridors of the island's facilities and the clinical stares of those who measured them. For them, humanity itself was fractured, broken not only by physical suffering, but by the theft of childhood, of identity, of belonging. The island's beauty, too, was its betrayal. To the outside world, these places looked serene, rocky cliffs rising from turquoise waters, palm groves swaying in the wind, seabirds circling overhead. Tourists on passing ships might have seen only a lonely outpost, never guessing that behind the walls lay rooms of metal tables, jars of preserved organs, cabinets filled with charts documenting human agony. The sea breeze carried both the scent of salt and the stench of antiseptic, though few beyond the gates ever breathed it. In time, whispers of the island experiments leaked beyond the water's edge. Survivors spoke, though their words were often doubted or dismissed. Records emerged, though many were incomplete or deliberately destroyed. The truth was difficult to grasp in its entirety, obscured by distance, by time, by the reluctance of institutions to acknowledge what had been done. And yet, fragments persist. Photographs of skeletal patients, faded notebooks filled with numbers, skeletal remains unearthed by chance. These fragments form a mosaic of cruelty, one that resists erasure no matter how deeply buried. The true legacy of these islands is not found in the scientific papers they produced, nor in the data that was salvaged and repurposed. It lies in the fracture of trust they created, the reminder that science, when untethered from compassion, can become indistinguishable from tyranny. It lies in the unmarked graves, the missing names, the families who never learned what became of their lost. It lies in the quiet unease of knowing that beauty can conceal horror, that the sound of waves can mask screams, that islands can be prisons disguised as sanctuaries. Even now, some of these islands remain abandoned, their buildings collapsing under the weight of salt and wind. Vines crawl over crumbling walls. Birds nest in the rafters of rooms that once held rows of beds. The sea pounds against cliffs as though trying to erase the structures altogether, to reclaim the land into its timeless cycle. Yet ruins do not forget. Walk through the corridors, and you can almost hear the echo of footsteps, the distant clang of metal trays, the murmur of voices speaking in the detached tones of science while human lives unravelled before them. The ocean, too, carries memory. Fishermen tell of strange catches near the shore, of bones tangled in nets, of whispers heard on the wind when storms gather. The island may be empty, but the water remembers. It laps against the stones as though counting the years, as though keeping vigil for those who never left. To think of the island is to think of humanity's breaking point, the place where distance became permission, where isolation became license, where cruelty flourished under the pretense of necessity. It was here, cut off from the world, that men revealed what they were capable of when freed from accountability, when armed with needles, scalpels, and the silence of the sea. And though the waves rise and fall, though the ruins crumble, though the records fade, the truth endures. There was an island where humanity was broken. And in the sleepless hours, when the mind wanders and the sea is imagined in darkness, the whispers still carry across the water, faint but unrelenting, a reminder that what was done in isolation still reaches us, even now. Progress has always worn two faces. One is hopeful, radiant with promise, the face that speaks of cures for disease, longer lives, healthier futures. The other is shadowed, twisted by ambition and blindness, where the pursuit of advancement becomes inseparable from cruelty. It was under this darker visage that humanity began to lace its own veins with poison, convinced that suffering today would pave the way to a brighter tomorrow. The idea was deceptively simple. To move forward, one must first understand the limits of the body. How much could a person endure? What substances might strengthen, weaken, or transform the human frame? In pursuit of these answers, men took bottles marked with chemical names, powders ground fine in laboratories, liquids that shimmered faintly under lamplight, and introduced them into unwilling subjects. The dream was progress, but progress laced with venom. Poisons had long been the obsession of kings and assassins, but here they were transfigured into scientific tools. Arsenic, mercury, cyanide, mustard gas, agents of death now repurposed for study. Some were tested as medicines, their toxic edges blunted in hope of uncovering new cures. Others were investigated as weapons, their capacity to destroy mapped in detail so future armies might wield them with precision. To the men who orchestrated these trials, the human beings who received the doses were not individuals with stories, but vessels into which poison could be poured until their bodies revealed their secrets. It began with the smallest measures. Drops of liquid slipped onto tongues, powders stirred into food, vapours inhaled through crude masks. The effects were observed closely: a tightening of the throat, a flush of the skin, a tremor in the hands. Notes filled pages with clinical detachment. No mention of terror, no acknowledgement of pain, only measurements of pulse and temperature, descriptions of muscle spasms, calculations of how long it took for a subject to collapse. Soon the doses increased. What had once caused discomfort now caused agony, vomiting that left the body hollow, seizures that shook the frame until bones fractured, internal bleeding that stained the skin with bruises from within. Still the scientists pressed forward, convinced that in the suffering they were unlocking knowledge too valuable to ignore. They told themselves these were sacrifices to progress, though the only ones making the sacrifice were those who never volunteered. There were experiments with gases too, clouds of invisible death released into sealed rooms where prisoners and patients were locked. The air grew thick, the lungs burned, eyes swelled shut as chemicals stripped away vision. Men clawed at doors that would not open, collapsed against walls slick with condensation, their last breaths recorded as data points in charts. The chambers were cleaned, aired out, and made ready for the next round. Progress demanded repetition, and repetition demanded more lives. The cruelty was not always in the dose itself, but in the illusion it carried. Subjects were sometimes told they were receiving treatment, that the injections or pills were medicine. They swallowed the poison with hope, not knowing it was despair in disguise. Some held on to the belief even as their bodies betrayed them, thinking that healing often begins with suffering. By the time the truth revealed itself, it was too late. The betrayal was as poisonous as the substance itself, eating away at the fragile trust between healer and patient, a trust that would never fully recover. Beyond the walls of laboratories and asylums, the poison dream spread into the streets. In some cities, entire populations became experiments without their knowledge. Water was tainted, food laced, air filled with chemicals released in the name of testing. Communities sickened, children wasted away, and families mourned losses they could not explain. For those in power, these were field trials, necessary steps toward understanding how poisons might spread through the masses. For the victims, it was inexplicable tragedy, sudden illness that arrived like a curse. Not all poisons killed quickly. Some lingered, seeping into the bones and blood, leaving survivors to suffer for years. Skin blistered and peeled, lungs scarred until each breath was a struggle, minds fogged with confusion and paranoia. Children were born deformed, carrying the silent inheritance of chemicals their parents never chose to receive. Entire lineages bore the weight of progress, their lives intent and broken by decisions made in laboratories far from their homes. The dream of progress justified everything. The men in white coats convinced themselves that the future demanded sacrifice, that every convulsion, every death, every grave dug in secret was paving the way for cures, for stronger soldiers, for a healthier humanity. But it was a lie dressed in noble words. What they pursued was not the salvation of all, but the triumph of a few. Not progress for humanity, but advancement for themselves and the institutions they served. Even in death, the victims were not granted peace. Bodies were dissected, organs harvested, tissues preserved in jars of formaldehyde. Laboratories filled with silent witnesses, rows of bottled livers, hearts, brains, each one labelled with numbers that erased the names of the people they once belonged to. The dead became data, their suffering catalogued for posterity, their humanity reduced to specimens floating in yellowed fluid. And yet, as with the frozen tundra and the islands of silence, fragments of what was learned survived. Treatments for poisoning, methods of detoxification, understanding of chemical exposure, all trace shadows of their origins back to these experiments. The medicines on pharmacy shelves, the protocols in hospitals, the warnings printed on bottles, they bear the hidden fingerprints of those whose suffering was never acknowledged. Progress was achieved, but at a price paid in veins filled with poison, in lungs burned by gas, in lives shortened by substances that promised nothing but torment. The poisoned dreams linger still, not only in history, but in memory. Survivors carried the effects long after the experiments ended, their bodies permanently marked, their minds haunted by visions of sealed rooms, of needles glinting in lamplight, of scientists' eyes that never softened. Families passed down stories like warnings, whispered reminders that behind every advancement might lie shadows we cannot see. At night, when silence settles and the air feels heavy, it is easy to imagine those whispers returning. The rasp of poisoned lungs, the choking gasps of air that would not fill, the silence of those who swallowed what they believed was salvation, only to find despair. These are the echoes of poisoned dreams, the reminders that progress, when severed from humanity, is not progress at all, but decay disguised as discovery. The history of science is littered with milestones that gleam like polished stones. But pick them up, and you will see the stains beneath, the fingerprints of those who were sacrificed, the shadows of those whose suffering was deemed necessary. Among them lie the poisoned dreams, fragile and haunting, dreams that promised a brighter tomorrow, but delivered only graves. The dreamers believed they were building the future. Instead, they were building cemeteries. Of all the places where cruelty was dressed as progress, the most haunting were those where children were chosen as the instruments of discovery. In the eyes of their captors, children carried what adults could not: purity, untested bodies, fresh canvases upon which to paint their experiments. They were small, defenceless, and unable to protest in ways that could be heard by those who had already decided their fate. And in that silence, the cruelties multiplied. Hospitals and orphanages, places that should have been sanctuaries of care, often became the most convenient reservoirs of subjects. Children without parents were considered easier to control, easier to erase. They had no guardians to ask questions, no voices to advocate for them. When doctors and researchers came with their needles, their powders, their strange machines, there was no one to stop them. In the name of medicine, children were stripped of innocence long before their time. Sometimes it began as a lie told gently. A nurse's soft voice would assure them that an injection would make them healthier, that a bitter liquid was medicine, that the strange room with its gleaming instruments was a place of healing. Small hands clutched together, small eyes widened, and the children obeyed because they trusted. What followed, however, was not comfort but torment. Burning chemicals coursing through veins, bones stretched until they cracked, exposure to diseases they never had until a scientist placed them in their bloodstream. The experiments were often justified as for the future. If children could endure, perhaps their suffering would shield future generations. But in the reality of those locked wards and hidden basements, it was less about protection and more about curiosity. A grotesque curiosity that asked questions without mercy. How long could a young body resist starvation? How would a child's immune system react when struck with a virus? How far could growth be stunted or accelerated if chemicals were introduced? Each question was asked with cold detachment. Each answer written in the suffering of small bodies that could not fight back. Diseases became deliberate gifts. Viruses like measles, smallpox, and tuberculosis were injected or inhaled, not by accident, but by design. Children developed fevers that made their small frames shake uncontrollably, coughs that tore at their throats, rashes that spread like fire across their skin. Scientists stood close by with notebooks, recording not the fear in their subjects' eyes, but the number of days until collapse, the precise moment when life flickered and went out. To them, these were data points. To the children, they were final moments filled with pain. Others were made subjects of malnutrition studies, their food reduced little by little, until their stomachs swelled and their ribs jutted sharply against skin. Hunger gnawed at them endlessly, their eyes dulling as days passed without nourishment. Doctors charted their weight loss, noted how the body cannibalized itself, described in precise language what starvation did to growing bones. The children cried quietly at first, then stopped crying altogether, as if their voices had finally accepted the futility of protest. Some experiments pushed even further into grotesque manipulations. Chemicals thought to stimulate growth or intelligence were administered in unknown quantities. Needles pierced thin arms, strange liquids dripped into veins, and the children were watched as if they were puzzles waiting to be solved. When the experiments failed, the children were discarded, their existence treated as failed trials rather than lives. There were also those subjected to psychological cruelty, their minds treated as malleable objects to be twisted and broken. Isolated in dark rooms, deprived of affection, their cries for comfort ignored, they were used to study the effects of neglect. Others were forced into endless repetition of tasks, their failures punished, their successes ignored, all to see how far endurance could stretch before the spirit collapsed. Childhood, meant to be a time of laughter and growth, was replaced by corridors of silence and the constant presence of watchful eyes. The cruelty was magnified by its intimacy. Unlike soldiers or prisoners, whose suffering was distant to those recording it, children forced their experimenters to confront innocence. Yet the men and women behind the glass found ways to harden themselves, to look past the trembling lips and tear-filled eyes. They told themselves that children were resilient, that they would forget, that their pain was temporary compared to the knowledge being gathered. In truth, the children never forgot, and for many, the pain was not temporary, but final. Communities would later discover fragments of these atrocities. Orphanages where mortality rates were suspiciously high, hospitals where children disappeared into basements and never returned, medical records filled with cold descriptions but missing names. Survivors occasionally spoke, their words fragile but searing. They remembered the needles, the strange pills, the men in coats who smiled without warmth. Some bore scars, physical reminders of surgeries they never consented to. Others carried only the scars in memory, of long nights spent in fear, of friends who went into rooms and never came out. What lingers most is the betrayal. Children trust by nature. They lean on adults for protection, for love, for safety. To take that trust and twist it into an instrument of suffering is a cruelty that echoes louder than any other. The betrayal was not just of the child, but of the very idea of humanity. In every culture, in every age, children are meant to be safeguarded, seen as the carriers of tomorrow. To turn them into test subjects was to deny that tomorrow had any value beyond data. Even decades later, the shadows remain. Some of the treatments and vaccines available today trace hidden roots back to these experiments. Knowledge was gained, but at a cost that cannot be measured in charts or statistics. For every vial of medicine that saves a life, there is a ghost of a child whose life was spent to fill it. For every protocol that shields the young today, there is a memory of those who were left unshielded when curiosity outweighed compassion. The halls where these experiments were conducted are quiet now, their walls painted over, their equipment removed. Yet if you listen closely, the silence still feels heavy, as though the air itself remembers. It is not difficult to imagine the faint sound of footsteps echoing down a hallway, the timid voices of children asking when they can go home, the sudden sharp cry when a needle pierces skin. These echoes do not fade easily, because they carry the weight of lives interrupted before they could bloom. Cruel curiosity did not only destroy the children, it also corroded the souls of those who carried it out. For every doctor who raised a syringe, for every nurse who held down a small arm, there was a choice made. They chose ambition over mercy, knowledge over innocence, progress over humanity. And in making that choice, they not only harmed the children before them, but ensured that their own names, if remembered at all, would be remembered in whispers of shame. The history of human experimentation is filled with atrocities, but when it turns to children, the shadows grow darkest. Their suffering cannot be rationalized as the consequence of war, or punishment, or the cruelty of enemies. It was deliberate, systematic, and cold. It was inflicted upon those least able to resist, those who should have been protected above all others. The story continues not in textbooks or celebrated discoveries, but in the silent gaps of history, the unnamed graves, the missing records, the faces never photographed. It is there, in the unspoken losses, that the truth remains clearest. Progress born of cruelty is not progress at all, but a hollow victory carved out of suffering. And when the victims are children, the hollowness deepens into something nearly unbearable. In the end, the legacy of these experiments is not only in what was learned, but in what was lost. Whole futures extinguished, laughter silenced, lives never allowed to unfold. These were not numbers on a page. They were children who might have grown, loved, and lived. Instead, they were consumed by curiosity that knew no mercy, sacrificed to dreams that were poisoned long before the first needle touched their skin. The corridors of the asylum were long and pale, stretching endlessly like tunnels of forgotten thought. Paint flaked from the walls, the colour dulled by decades of damp air and neglect. And the light, what little there was, filtered through barred windows, laying across the floor in cold, fractured patterns. Silence lived here, but it was not the silence of peace. It was a silence heavy with breath, with muffled cries behind locked doors, with the faint scrape of iron keys against rusted locks. For centuries, asylums promised to be sanctuaries for the vulnerable, places where minds adrift could find calm, where those overwhelmed by the storms of thought might be shielded from the world outside. But in truth, these institutions became laboratories of despair. The patients were hidden from view, their voices rarely believed, and in their seclusion, they became convenient subjects for a science more interested in control than compassion. It began with observation, always observation. Men with clipboards stood at the edge of rooms, watching as patients rocked back and forth, muttered to themselves, or stared endlessly at cracks in the walls. Every twitch, every tremor, every incoherent word was recorded, though rarely understood. What had once been a person's unique suffering became a line of data, stripped of context, stripped of humanity. And when observation no longer satisfied the hunger for knowledge, intervention followed. Needles gleamed beneath the dim light, carrying serums designed to calm the restless or shatter the mind into fragments that could be studied. Injections were given not once, but repeatedly, until hands shook, tongues grew thick, and thoughts slowed to an unnatural crawl. Some drugs brought euphoria, a forced smile spreading across faces that had long forgotten how to laugh. Others brought terror, hallucinations of shadows lurking in corners, voices that grew louder with each passing night. Patients clawed at their own skin, begged unseen figures to leave them alone, all while doctors stood close by, scribbling notes. Electricity soon followed. Straps secured wrists and ankles to metal frame beds, cloths stuffed between teeth to muffle screams. Electrodes were placed against temples, and with the flip of a switch, bodies convulsed violently, arching upward as if trying to escape themselves. The smell of singed hair and burned skin clung to the air long after the current stopped. Some patients awoke with no memory of who they were, their minds blank canvases wiped clean by surges of power. Others never awoke at all, their silence recorded not as tragedy, but as a failed trial. There were also surgeries, crude, invasive, final. The most infamous was the lobotomy, where thin rods of metal were slid through the eye socket into the soft tissue of the brain. A quick motion, a twist, and something vital was severed. The patient, once restless or anguished, now sat quietly, a hollow version of themselves. To the surgeon, this was success, a difficult case resolved. To the world outside, it was presented as progress. But to those who knew the patients before and after, it was the erasure of a person, a theft of self dressed as treatment. The asylums became factories of silence. Hallways once filled with cries grew quieter as patients were drugged, shocked, or cut into submission. Beds lined the walls of cavernous wards where figures sat slumped, staring blankly at nothing, their spirits dimmed. Nurses moved between them with practiced detachment, offering food, water, and more injections, their footsteps echoing in the heavy stillness. The air smelled of disinfectant, iron, and despair. And yet, behind the locked doors, not all was silence. Some rooms carried whispers, muttered prayers, songs sung to no one, lullabies remembered from childhood. In the darkness, patients hummed softly, their voices trembling but persistent. These fragile sounds were often dismissed as symptoms of madness, but they were acts of survival, small rebellions against the suffocating weight of the institution. The songs were not for the doctors or the nurses, but for themselves, to remind the singers that they were still alive, still human, even as the world tried to strip that from them. The cruelty was not always loud. Sometimes it lived in neglect, the withholding of care, the indifference to pain. A patient would collapse in the corner of a cell, left unattended for hours until their breathing slowed and stopped. Meals were served cold and sparse, leaving bodies frail, eyes sunken. Winters seeped into the walls, blankets too thin to keep away the chill, while summers baked the rooms until the air was nearly unbreathable, and through it all, doctors recorded their findings, as if the suffering was simply another experiment unfolding naturally. It is tempting to believe these acts belonged only to distant times, but the shadows stretch closer. Even in the modern age, echoes of the asylum remain. Drugs tested without consent, treatments administered more for control than healing, vulnerable patients dismissed as less than human. The sterile wards may be newer, the walls brighter, but the silence remains heavy. And the questions linger about what progress demanded from those who could not refuse. What makes the silent rooms so haunting is not only the cruelty inflicted, but the way it was hidden behind the guise of care. Families sent their loved ones into these institutions with hope, believing they would be safe. Instead, they became subjects of experiments never revealed, their conditions worsened by those who claimed to heal. Letters sent to inquire after them often went unanswered, or returned with vague assurances. And when death came, it was explained as a natural end, the truth buried with the body. The walls of these asylums hold memories that do not fade. Visitors who step into their ruins today often describe the same sensation, the oppressive weight of silence, as though the air itself remembers. Dust coats the floors, but beneath it lies the imprint of countless footsteps. Rusted beds still line the wards, their frames skeletal reminders of the lives that once lay upon them. Graffiti covers some walls, but the older marks, scratches etched by desperate hands, speak louder. Initials, dates, simple words like help carved into stone or wood, messages left behind in hope that someone, someday, might see and understand. Progress once again was claimed, but at a price. The knowledge of the mind advanced, but through the breaking of minds. Treatments for illness emerged, but carried within them the ghosts of those silenced in locked rooms. The cost was never paid by the doctors who signed their names to papers, but by the patients whose names were erased from memory. At night, when the world outside is quiet, the imagination drifts to those rooms. You can almost hear the faint crackle of electricity, the restrained sobs behind barred doors, the shuffle of bare feet on cold stone floors. And beneath it all, the silence of those who could no longer speak, who had been drugged or cut or shocked into quiet submission. It is a silence that accuses, that reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge without mercy is not healing, but destruction. The asylums are relics now, many abandoned, their windows broken, their walls overtaken by vines. Yet their memory endures, carried in the stories of survivors, in the records that escape destruction, in the whispers of history that refuse to be silenced. They stand as monuments not to progress, but to the dangers of forgetting that every patient, every subject, is a human being first. And so the silent rooms remain, echoing, accusing, reminding. There is a weight to the title of doctor, a word that should carry reassurance, trust, and the promise of healing. For centuries, the physician's hand was imagined as steady and merciful, a bridge between suffering and relief. Yet history reveals moments when that trust was not only betrayed, but deliberately inverted. When those sworn to heal chose to harm, and the sanctity of medicine was hollowed out into something cruel. In the quiet of sterile rooms and hidden chambers, the figure in the white coat ceased to be protector, and instead became tormentor. The transformation was subtle at first. Curiosity sharpened into ambition. Ambition hardened into obsession. And obsession eroded the boundaries of morality. Patients stopped being people. They became cases, specimens, opportunities. A cough was not a plea for comfort, but a chance to study disease in real time. A shiver of fear was not something to soothe, but a variable to measure. The doctor, once a guardian, began to look upon human beings as raw material for discovery. This transformation was most terrifying because it was not carried out by madmen in dark alleys, but by respected professionals, often celebrated in their lifetimes. Their laboratories gleamed, their papers were published, their names recorded in medical journals. Outwardly, they appeared to embody progress. Yet behind closed doors, their work revealed the grotesque side of knowledge. Amputations performed without anesthesia to measure endurance. Injections of untested substances to see how long a body could resist collapse. Deliberate infections spread in sterile wards as though disease were a gift to be bestowed. Some of these so-called healers revelled in control. They found a perverse satisfaction in watching their subjects writhe or weaken under treatments disguised as cures. Needles became instruments not of relief, but of domination. Pills were handed out not with gentle reassurance, but with an unspoken certainty that suffering would follow. And when their patients begged for mercy, the pleas were recorded clinically, as if pain itself were a symptom to be measured rather than a warning to stop. The cruelty deepened in times of war, when desperation cloaked brutality in the language of necessity. Doctors were given permission, even encouragement, to abandon ethics in the pursuit of knowledge that might give their nation an edge. In these moments, the mask of healer slipped entirely. Their hands delivered not comfort, but deliberate torment. Frostbite induced to study the limits of human endurance. Poisons introduced to test antidotes, wounds inflicted, so that healing, or failure to heal, could be examined. The patients were not strangers from the battlefield, but civilians, prisoners, and the marginalised, those deemed expendable. It is chilling to imagine the scene. A man in a white coat enters a dimly lit ward, instruments glinting at his side. His voice is calm, almost reassuring, as he speaks of tests, of treatments, of progress. The subject, restrained or too weak to resist, listens with fragile hope, unaware of what is to come. Moments later, pain floods their body, not by accident, but by design. And standing over them, expression steady, is the doctor, unmoved, unshaken, writing notes as life is drained from the patient before him. The betrayal was not confined to physical suffering. Minds too were subjected to experiments that fractured identity. Drugs altering perception, shocks meant to erase memory, isolation designed to study madness, all were inflicted under the guise of therapy. Patients awoke not remembering their own names, their personalities hollowed out by forced treatments. To those who carried out the procedures, this was evidence of success, proof that the mind could be shaped, broken, or remade. To the victims, it was annihilation of self, a theft far deeper than the body alone could endure. What makes these stories so haunting is that many of these doctors believed themselves righteous. They argued that the suffering of a few would lead to the salvation of many. They claimed that their hands were stained not with cruelty, but with the burden of progress. And yet, the truth lies in the faces of those they left broken, in the graves filled quietly, in the lives cut short without dignity. Progress, when divorced from compassion, became a beast that consumed everything in its path. Families entrusted their loved ones to these figures, believing in the authority of their titles. Mothers left children in their care. Husbands and wives placed hope in their diagnoses. Communities funded their institutions. What they received in return were bodies returned lifeless, minds shattered, or silence that stretched on forever. The betrayal was not only of patients, but of entire societies that believed in the sanctity of medicine. The silence of the victims is perhaps the most deafening. Many left no record, no testimony, their final words unheard outside the walls of the laboratory. But the evidence remains in archives, in journals that documented each trial with clinical detachment. Reading them today, one finds no recognition of suffering, only numbers, charts, and results. The humanity was stripped away twice, once in the act and again in the record. Some survivors did speak, though their words were often dismissed or disbelieved. They described rooms filled with the smell of disinfectant and fear, tables cold beneath their skin, voices instructing them to remain still as procedures began. They spoke of needles sliding beneath flesh, of liquids that made them burn or tremble, of treatments that left them hollowed out and unrecognizable to themselves. And behind every description was the image of a doctor's face, serene, detached, monstrous, precisely because it showed so little recognition of the harm being done. The transformation of healer into monster did not happen in darkness alone. It was often celebrated in daylight, funded by governments, supported by institutions, hidden in plain sight beneath the polished veneer of science. Awards were given, lectures delivered, reputations built on the suffering of those who had no voice. Only later, when the truth could no longer be hidden, did the facade crumble, revealing the horrors that lay beneath. The question that lingers is how men and women, trained to heal, could cross that line so completely. Was it ambition, the lure of recognition, the promise of discovery? Or was it something colder, a willingness to strip others of their humanity in order to maintain the illusion of their own authority? Whatever the answer, the result was the same. Doctors who should have been guardians became architects of torment, their white coats as stained as any executioner's blade. Today, we inherit the knowledge they left behind, a knowledge that saves lives, even as it carries the memory of how it was gained. Medicines, treatments, techniques. Many trace their roots back to experiments that cost human lives. Every cure carries within it a shadow, a reminder that progress was not always born from compassion, but often from cruelty. And when one walks through the ruins of old hospitals, through wards that once echoed with restrained cries, the weight of that betrayal lingers still. The walls remember. The silence remembers. The air itself seems heavy with accusation. For the title of doctor may inspire trust, but history reminds us that even the most sacred titles can be corrupted. When compassion is abandoned, when curiosity hardens into cruelty, when healing is replaced with harm, the doctor becomes something far worse than an enemy. He becomes a monster, cloaked in mercy's disguise. And that is perhaps the most frightening figure of all. The word theatre carries with it the promise of spectacle, of seats filled with anticipation, of lights rising upon a stage where human emotion is laid bare. But in the history of medicine, the theatre became something far more unsettling. Behind closed doors, and sometimes even in front of watchful crowds, lives were placed upon tables as if they were props in a performance. The instruments were not violins or scripts, but needles, scalpels, saws, and clamps. And the actors were not volunteers. They were the unwilling, the powerless, the silenced. These theatres of medicine were not hidden in shadows. They often stood proudly at the heart of universities, hospitals, and research halls. Their walls were tiled and clean, their lamps polished bright, their floors cold but spotless. To the untrained eye, they radiated the dignity of science. Yet upon their tables, the scenes unfolded like tragedies without end. Here, doctors and students gathered not to heal, but to witness. The body upon the table cut open for exploration, for experiment, for knowledge ripped out of living flesh. The patient, more often victim than participant, lay still, sometimes held down by restraints, sometimes subdued by crude doses of chloroform or alcohol, but just as often fully conscious, trembling under the gaze of those who watched. Their fear was not private. It became part of the demonstration, part of the lesson. The cries, the gasps, the thrashing, all were absorbed into the atmosphere as if they were just another set of data points. In those moments, suffering itself was transformed into spectacle. The instruments gleamed under lamplight, each one an extension of curiosity sharpened into steel. Needles pierced skin not to heal, but to test endurance, to deliver unknown substances, to watch the body react in real time. Knives traced lines across flesh, not out of necessity, but out of desire to explore what lay beneath. Veins were exposed, organs handled, nerves prodded, as though the human body were no more than an anatomical puzzle waiting to be solved. Some of these theatres were filled with onlookers, rows of students seated like an audience, notebooks in hand, pens scratching furiously as they copied observations. For them, it was education. For the one on the table, it was torment. The contrast could not have been sharper. A room buzzing with intellectual excitement, while a single person endured the weight of unimaginable pain below. The walls echoed not with applause, but with the muffled sounds of restrained cries, each one absorbed into the cold tiles, as though the building itself wished to forget. In these rooms, the boundary between necessity and cruelty dissolved. It was one thing to teach anatomy, to explore the mysteries of the body. But as ambition grew, so too did the hunger to push limits. What happens if this nerve is severed while the subject lives? How much blood can be drained before consciousness slips away? How do the lungs respond if fluid is poured into them? These were not questions asked in whispers. They were asked aloud, answered with demonstrations, the results written down as though they were the simplest facts of nature. And there was no shortage of subjects. The poor, the imprisoned, the orphaned, the colonized, those stripped of power were often stripped of bodily autonomy as well. Consent was a word that carried no weight in these theatres. A prisoner was delivered to the table with chains clinking. An orphan was brought in by caretakers who saw them as expendable. A patient from the wards was promised treatment, but found themselves lying beneath the glare of surgical lamps instead. In each case, the body became property, a resource to be used and discarded. The needles and knives told their own silent stories. The needle, thin and gleaming, held the promise of both relief and poison. In the hands of healers, it could deliver life-saving medicine. But in these theatres, it became a tool for injecting uncertainty, strange serums, toxins, or experimental concoctions that coursed through veins while the audience waited to see if the body would resist or collapse. The knife, heavier, slower, carried finality. Its edge separated flesh from flesh, its path leaving marks that no salve could undo. Every incision was a question asked directly to the body, and every drop of blood was treated as an answer. Imagine the silence when the moment of cutting arrived. Conversations paused, pens lifted, breaths caught in collective suspense. The blade descended, parted skin, revealed the red beneath. Some in the audience leaned forward eagerly, eyes wide with fascination. Others, more hesitant, looked away but could not escape the sounds, the tearing, the gasping, the unsteady rhythm of a life being opened. It was theatre indeed, but not one where the actors chose to play their parts. The cruelty of these theatres did not always appear as sadism. Sometimes it was cloaked in detachment, in the cold insistence that this was for knowledge, for progress, for the betterment of mankind. The doctors spoke not of suffering, but of results, not of pain, but of data. They rationalized that one body sacrificed might save thousands in the future. But such justifications did nothing to ease the agony of the person on the table, whose life was reduced to a single line in a notebook. And sometimes, beneath the calm exterior, there was indeed a darker satisfaction. Power has a way of seducing those who wield it. To hold a knife over another human being, to decide how much pain they endure, to control whether they lived or died, it was a kind of dominion that few resisted once granted. The theatre was not only a place of learning, but of authority, where the doctor's word was law and the subject's suffering irrelevant. Outside those sterile rooms, life went on as usual. Families walked past the buildings unaware of the cries muffled within. Students graduated with honours, carrying forward knowledge obtained through blood. Papers were published, discoveries celebrated, reputations made. The theatres themselves became monuments to progress, their darker purpose hidden beneath the pride of achievement. But the shadows remain. Walk into an abandoned surgical theatre today, and the atmosphere still feels heavy. The wooden benches, curved like an amphitheatre, seem to watch the centre table with silent judgment. The lamps overhead, long extinguished, recall the brightness that once illuminated countless procedures. The tiled walls whisper with memories of echoes long gone, the scratch of pens, the shuffle of feet, the muted whimpers of those who could not escape. Every needle that pierced, every knife that cut, added another layer to the story. Not of healing, but of how far human curiosity could go when stripped of compassion. The victims became anonymous, their names forgotten, their lives erased into the folds of history. Yet their suffering built foundations upon which modern medicine still stands. That is the paradox. The cures we celebrate today carry shadows of the cruelty from which they were born. The theatre of needles and knives was not confined to one country or one era. It stretched across continents, across centuries, repeating itself with chilling regularity wherever power met vulnerability. Different languages, different justifications, but always the same pattern: a body on the table, an audience of observers, instruments glinting in the light, and knowledge gained through suffering. When the doors closed at the end of the day, when the instruments were washed and set aside, when the students filed out, the silence returned. The victim, if they survived, was carried away, broken in body and spirit. If they did not, they were quietly disposed of, their absence unremarked, their sacrifice swallowed by the machinery of progress. And yet, the theatre leaves us with a haunting truth. That progress, when pursued without empathy, becomes indistinguishable from cruelty. The hands that held the needles and knives may have called themselves healers, but history remembers them differently. Their theatres were not places of light, but of shadow, where the performance was pain and the applause was silence. In that silence, even now, one can almost hear the echoes: the scrape of metal against bone, the restrained cry that fades into nothing, the scratching of pens, eager to capture every detail. And above it all, the figure of the doctor, calm, composed, the conductor of a performance that history will never forget. Knowledge is often spoken of as a treasure, a light that guides humanity out of darkness. Yet the light of knowledge has never been pure. Sometimes it has been won through whispers, through quiet study, through patient observation. But there are other times, darker times, when knowledge was seized by force, torn out of living bodies, purchased not with money or time, but with suffering. The story of human progress is not written only in ink and parchment. It is written in scars, in wounds, in the cries of those who were used as raw material in experiments they never chose. The pursuit of medical discovery in certain centuries was less a gentle unravelling of mysteries than a brutal extraction. Flesh became currency. The weak became subjects. The desperate became test cases. What we call breakthroughs were, at their heart, built on foundations of pain. Every chart, every graph, every line of a medical text had, behind it, lives diminished to the role of specimens. The cost was not measured in coins, but in bodies. Bodies that bled, bodies that burned, bodies that endured agonies in the name of progress. Imagine, for a moment, the laboratory of a 19th century physician driven by ambition. The room is narrow, crowded with instruments gleaming faintly in lamplight. The shelves are lined with jars holding organs suspended in cloudy liquid, labelled not with names but with numbers. On the table lies a human being, frail, trembling, their eyes darting toward the door that will not open. The physician does not see a person in that moment. He sees possibility. He sees answers that the world demands. He sees a chance at recognition. And so, with gloved hands and sharpened steel, he begins. The needle pierces not to heal, but to probe. The incision slices not to save, but to reveal. The subject gasps, writhes, sometimes pleads, but those sounds dissolve into the background hum of the laboratory, no more troubling than the hiss of gas lamps or the scrape of metal. What matters is the observation, the way the heart falters under shock, the way the lungs shudder when fluids are introduced, the way the brain reacts when deprived of oxygen. Each twitch, each scream, each fading heartbeat is recorded with meticulous precision. It was in this way that certain truths about the body were uncovered. But at what cost? The textbooks that modern medicine reveres are haunted by this debt. Behind sterile diagrams of anatomy lie stories of people who did not volunteer, who were not honoured, who were consumed by the relentless hunger of science. The body became a map, but it was a map drawn in blood. The phrase, "the greater good," has long been a shield for those who inflict harm in the name of discovery. Doctors spoke of saving lives, of curing diseases, of advancing humanity. And indeed, many of the practices that today preserve health have their roots in these brutal experiments. But the subjects did not live to see those benefits. They did not share in the promise of future cures. They bore only the burden of their suffering, their flesh, the silent payment for knowledge they would never use. Consider the experiments on the condemned. Throughout history, prisons were not only places of punishment, but sources of bodies. The logic was simple. Society had already marked them as disposable, so their lives could be repurposed. Execution was delayed not out of mercy, but to allow doctors to test how long the human body could endure starvation, or how diseases might spread through open wounds. The cells of the prison became extensions of the laboratory, their walls echoing not only with despair, but with the cold calculations of men in white coats. Then there were the children, whose small bodies became sites of cruel exploration. Orphans, abandoned infants, the nameless and voiceless, perfect in the eyes of experimenters, because no one would ask after them. Needles delivered untested vaccines, scalpel blades traced lines across delicate skin. Strange chemicals were poured into mouths that could not protest. The children were not protected by innocence. Instead, their vulnerability made them ideal. Their suffering was deemed acceptable because their lives had been declared by society as lesser, as already lost. The price of knowledge was also paid in colonized lands, where entire populations were treated as living laboratories. In villages far from the eyes of the powerful, doctors introduced diseases deliberately to study their course, withheld treatments to see how long bodies might resist, or applied experimental drugs to test their strength. The subjects were told little, often nothing. Their bodies became records of resilience and collapse, data points in reports that would later be read by men in distant capitals who would never meet the people whose pain provided the information. In each of these stories, there was a pattern. The experimenter's face lit with curiosity, the subject's face shadowed with fear. One saw opportunity, the other endured torment. Between them stood a silence, heavy and unbridgeable, the silence of power. For those with instruments in their hands, the suffering became invisible, reduced to a detail in a ledger, a reaction in a chart. Yet for the one lying on the table, every second stretched into eternity. Even the language used in these reports reveals the cost. Subjects were described not as people, but as cases, samples, instances. Pain was measured in detached phrases. Subject expired after injection. Specimen ceased movement. Reaction to incision was marked. Each line stripped away humanity, leaving only cold fragments of observation. The language itself became part of the cruelty, ensuring that those who suffered remained faceless, forgotten. The irony is that much of this knowledge is still with us. Techniques refined in pain are now routine. Vaccines, surgeries, treatments all stand upon foundations built with suffering. Medicine today saves millions, but its roots are tangled with shadows. To look too closely is to see the uneasy truth, that the relief of one generation was purchased by the torment of another. What does it mean to say knowledge has a price? It means that for every life saved by a medical advance, there may have been a life lost in its creation. It means that the textbooks on which students build their learning were written not only with ink, but with blood. It means that progress has often been a bargain with suffering, one generation consuming the flesh of another in order to advance. And this debt does not vanish. It lingers in the corners of old hospitals, in the faded notes of medical reports, in the silence of mass graves. It lingers in the questions that rise unbidden. Could knowledge have been gained without cruelty? Was the sacrifice truly unavoidable? Or was it perhaps a reflection of how easily humanity turns away from compassion when ambition whispers its promises? Walk through an old medical archive and you can feel it still. The brittle pages of case studies, the sketches of dissected bodies, the diagrams of failed experiments. They are heavy in the hand, heavier in the mind, is a reminder that knowledge, once taken, cannot be returned. It carries its cost forever, and that cost was measured in flesh. The corridors of history are filled with these silent payments. They remind us that progress is not a simple triumph, but a complex shadow, a story in which light and darkness are intertwined. The scientists may have justified their work, society may have applauded their discoveries, but the truth remains. The price of knowledge was paid not by them, but by those who had no choice, whose suffering was hidden, whose lives ended not in recognition, but in obscurity. And as the story of human curiosity continues, that shadow follows. It whispers a warning that knowledge without mercy is never free, that every advance may carry with it a debt yet unpaid. The price of knowledge, once taken in flesh, leaves scars that stretch across centuries, reminding us that progress too can wound. There are places in the world where the soil itself seems uneasy, where the earth has swallowed more than time should allow. Beneath quiet fields, under abandoned courtyards, in forgotten corners of cities, lie graves that were never meant to be remembered. These are not the honoured resting places of the dead, marked with stones and flowers. They are unmarked pits, hastily dug, where bodies were discarded not as lives once lived, but as remnants of experiments carried too far. The ground does not speak, yet it holds everything. Bones whisper of restraint, of sudden death, of lives ended before their time. Teeth show the marks of malnutrition, jaws clenched in the final moments, ribs fractured in procedures that left no chance of healing, skulls pierced where needles had been forced. The soil is thick with silence, but silence is not emptiness. It is memory, pressed down through decades, waiting for those who are willing to look. Excavations sometimes reveal these stories, long after the perpetrators have died. Shovels break the surface, and what emerges is not simply bone. It is evidence, testimony etched in marrow. Rows of skeletons tell of numbers, of scale. Child-sized remains speak of innocence lost. Groups buried together reveal how quickly bodies were discarded once their usefulness expired. Each grave becomes a document, a ledger written not in words, but in the language of bones. And yet, for every grave uncovered, countless more remain hidden. Hospitals that once doubled as laboratories quietly paved over their courtyards, building new wings atop ground that was never cleansed. Military bases concealed their past beneath manicured lawns and training fields. Colonies abandoned by empires still hold the remains of those used in experiments far from the eyes of the powerful. The earth holds secrets because it was forced to, and because those who dug the graves hoped the passing of years would erase what they had done. The presence of these graves is a reminder that experiments did not end at the moment of death. The bodies continued to serve their purpose, dissected, catalogued, preserved in jars, or buried without name. The experimenters may have washed their hands and written their reports, but the ground remembers what they discarded. The soil does not forget the weight it was asked to carry. There is a particular stillness that lingers over such sites. Visitors often describe a feeling of unease, a heaviness in the air. It is as though the silence is too deep, too deliberate. Trees grow in twisted shapes, roots pressing down into the past. Birds avoid the area, their songs muted as if the air itself resists melody. At dusk, when shadows lengthen, the land seems to watch, as though aware of its own burden. These impressions may not be measurable, but they linger all the same, reminders that memory is not confined to the human mind. Archaeologists and historians who uncover these sites tread carefully. Each bone must be treated not as an artifact, but as a person. Yet even in careful hands, the reality of what emerges is unbearable. Rows of skulls reveal experiments in cranial surgery, holes drilled crudely, some healed, others fatal. Arm bones show fractures caused not by accident, but by force. Children's skeletons, tiny and fragile, speak louder than words ever could. Their presence is an accusation, a question directed at history. Why were they here, and who thought their suffering was justified? The graves also reveal the scale of secrecy. Reports in official archives may mention samples or cases, but the earth shows the truth. Dozens, hundreds, sometimes thousands. Each grave is a ledger, balanced in silence. Each skeleton, a line that was omitted from written records. The contrast is stark. The paper trails are thin, cautious, careful. The ground tells a story sprawling and undeniable. For families who never knew what became of their relatives, these discoveries reopen wounds that were never allowed to heal. Generations grew up with unanswered questions, told only that their loved ones disappeared, or died in hospitals under vague circumstances, or never returned from service. To learn that their bodies were used in experiments, then cast aside into nameless pits, is to feel the betrayal of both science and society. The graves are not only sites of history, but of grief that stretches across time, grief that refuses to vanish, because it was never given space to begin. Some governments and institutions acknowledge these discoveries, offering apologies, memorials, or compensation. Others remain silent, fearing the weight of truth. In some cases, graves are quietly covered again. The bones return to the soil with little fanfare, as though burying them twice might finally erase the shame. Yet the earth remembers. No stone, no plaque, no apology can fully remove what the soil has already absorbed. The unsettling part is how ordinary these sites often appear. A grassy lawn where children now play. A hospital garden where flowers bloom. A vacant lot where weeds have overtaken cracked pavement. Passers-by have no reason to suspect that beneath their feet lie the remains of experiments that pushed the limits of cruelty. The contrast between surface tranquility and buried horror is almost too much to comprehend. It reveals how easily history conceals itself in plain sight. The graves remind us of a simple truth. Experiments did not end with results. They ended with bodies, and those bodies had to go somewhere. Each grave is proof that human life was treated as disposable, that once the data was collected, the person who provided it ceased to matter. Flesh became waste. Life became refuse. The earth was forced to carry what society refused to see, and so the past lingers, restless beneath our feet. Not all secrets remain hidden. Heavy rains sometimes wash bones to the surface. Construction projects uncover skeletons where no records mention burials. Farmers ploughing fields strike against skulls or ribs. Each unearthing is a reminder that history does not vanish simply because we look away. The ground eventually yields what it was forced to hide, pushing the truth upward until it demands recognition. Standing at the edge of such a site, one feels the weight of lives reduced to fragments. The silence is not empty. It is dense, pressing down like a fog. The graves whisper not with voices, but with the undeniable presence of what lies beneath. They ask questions no historian can fully answer. How much knowledge was worth this? Who decided their suffering could be justified? And why has it taken so long for the living to listen to the dead? The answers are not easy, but the graves ensure that the questions cannot be ignored. They remind us that progress, however celebrated, has its shadows. That beneath the stories of discovery and innovation are layers of silence, each one filled with the bodies of those who were sacrificed. The ground carries them still, pressing upward against our collective forgetting. In the end, the graves do not release their secrets easily. They reveal them slowly, piece by piece, forcing us to confront what was buried not only in soil, but in memory. They remind us that the cost of knowledge is not abstract. It has weight, it has shape, it has names, even if those names are lost, even if those who carried them lie in silence. The graves hold them, and in doing so, they hold us too, demanding that we acknowledge what was taken, what was hidden, and what must never be forgotten. There comes a point where the weight of history presses so heavily that one can almost hear it breathing. The laboratories, the wards, the theatres, the graves, all of them leave an echo that does not fade. It is not simply the story of experiments gone too far, nor just the tally of those who suffered. It is something larger, something more unsettling. It is the slow dimming of the human spirit itself, the moment when compassion is extinguished in the pursuit of control, when science becomes an instrument of cruelty, when curiosity devours conscience. That moment is nightfall, and it has settled many times over the human soul. The nightfall is not marked by the setting of the sun or the ticking of a clock. It arrives quietly, almost unnoticed, in the small choices made by those who believed they were advancing knowledge. A doctor deciding not to look into the eyes of his patient. A student writing down numbers while ignoring the cries behind them. A government official signing a paper that turned a village into a test site. No single act sounds like thunder, yet together they darken the horizon until all light seems consumed. What makes these moments so haunting is how ordinary they seem to those who enacted them. There were no cloaks of villains, no dramatic proclamations of evil intent. Instead, there were white coats, polished boots, steady voices, and the calm language of research. Pain was reduced to data, lives to specimens, morality to procedure. Nightfall did not arrive with chaos. It arrived with order, with neat reports filed away in cabinets, with charts that translated screams into lines and numbers. The soul of humanity falters not when tragedy strikes from nature, but when cruelty is chosen deliberately. In the history of human experiments, cruelty was not an accident. It was a design. Needles were sharpened for it. Knives were sterilized for it. Entire rooms were built to hold it. And the souls of those who carried it out dimmed in the process, for to wound another is to wound oneself, even if the scar is hidden beneath years of justification. Consider the silence of those who knew and said nothing. Nurses who turned away as patients were led into locked rooms. Neighbours who heard the muffled sounds from hospital basements, but chose not to ask questions. Officials who buried reports because the truth was inconvenient. This too is part of the nightfall, the slow, steady erasure of responsibility. For darkness spreads not only through those who act, but through those who allow it to continue, step by step, until cruelty is normalized and no longer recognized for what it is. The nightfall deepens further when we realize how easily memory fades. Generations pass, and the graves grow cold. The textbooks remove the names, preserving only the discoveries. What was once a living person becomes a statistic, then a footnote, then nothing at all. This forgetting is not natural. It is part of the same machinery that sought to erase suffering from the start. To forget is to let the night swallow what little light remains. And yet, not all is erased. Fragments of testimony survive. Letters written in desperation, notes smuggled out of institutions, whispers recorded in diaries. Bones remain in the earth, stubborn and silent, refusing to vanish. Old buildings hold their atmosphere long after the lamps are extinguished. These remnants resist the night, though their voices are faint. They remind us that even in the darkest chapters, traces of humanity endure, waiting to be recognized. What unsettles most is the recognition that nightfall is not confined to the past. The same forces that once dimmed compassion still linger. The hunger for power, the promise of progress at any cost, the belief that some lives matter less than others. These shadows stretch across time, warning that the conditions for cruelty are never far away. When ambition outruns empathy, when convenience silences conscience, the night begins to gather again. The human soul is fragile, not because it can be broken in one blow, but because it can be dimmed little by little, almost without notice. A doctor accepts one unethical practice. A student repeats it. A system rewards them both. Soon the unthinkable becomes routine, and the night has fallen before anyone realizes the light is gone. That is how laboratories became theatres, how hospitals became prisons, how graves filled with nameless bodies. The descent is not dramatic. It is gradual, almost quiet, like dusk creeping over a landscape. The survivors of such experiments carry the night within them. Those who live to speak tell stories laced with silence, for there are some pains too deep for words. Their memories are not only of what was done to them, but of the emptiness in the eyes of those who did it. That emptiness is the truest mark of nightfall. The moment when one human looks at another and sees not a person, but a tool, an object, a number. In that gaze, the soul is lost, And yet there remains the faintest glimmer of resistance. The fact that these stories are remembered, that graves are uncovered, that documents are studied, is proof that nightfall, though heavy, is not absolute. The human soul is scarred, but not extinguished. In the telling of these histories, in the acknowledgement of those who suffered, a fragile light flickers. It does not erase what was done, but it refuses to let silence have the final word. Still, the warning remains. Nightfall over the human soul is not a single event sealed in history. It is a recurring possibility. It waits at the edges of ambition, at the corners of indifference, in the shadows of unchecked authority. It begins not with screams, but with whispers, with small compromises, with the quiet turning away of eyes. And once it begins, it spreads until entire generations carry its weight, until graves fill with secrets, until the earth itself becomes heavy with memory. Standing at the threshold of this darkness, one can only ask, how easily would we recognize it if it came again? Would the lamps of progress blind us to the cries behind the walls? Would the promise of discovery outweigh the cost of suffering? Would we notice the dusk before it became night? These are not questions confined to the past. They are questions that stretch their hands toward us, demanding answers we may not yet be ready to give. Nightfall over the human soul is not complete darkness. It is the hour when shadows lengthen, when the line between knowledge and cruelty blurs, when the weight of history presses so heavily that it threatens to crush empathy itself. It is a warning written not in books, but in scars, not in speeches, but in silence. And it lingers, waiting, as if to remind us that the soul of humanity is always at risk, always fragile, always capable of dimming if we are not vigilant. In that lingering silence, one hears the echo of all that came before, the cries in the laboratories, the footsteps in the hospital corridors, the scratching of pens in the theatres, the stillness of the graves. Together, they form a chorus, not of voices, but of absence, reminding us that nightfall is not simply history, it is possibility. And it rests upon us whether the soul of humanity remains dimmed, or whether, at last, we find the courage to hold the light. And so tonight's journey comes to an end. We have walked through corridors where the air still carries the weight of chemicals, through locked rooms where whispers of suffering were mistaken for progress, through the laboratories and hospitals and prisons where humanity was broken down in the name of knowledge. What we have faced together is not just history, it is the reminder of how fragile compassion can be when ambition is allowed to run unchecked. These stories are heavy, not because they belong to the past, but because they remind us of what people are capable of when mercy is stripped away. We have seen how the innocent became experiments, how trust was turned into betrayal, and how the pursuit of discovery left scars deeper than any cure. They are not simply tales of cruelty, they are warnings whispered across time, urging us not to forget. So, as the night settles and silence returns, I want to ask you something. Which part of this story stayed with you the most? Which shadow lingered the longest? Share it in the comments, because every reflection keeps the memory of those lives alive, and every thought helps us carry the weight of their silence together. And before you drift away, take a second to subscribe. It may seem like a small thing, but it helps these stories find others who might be listening in the quiet hours just like you. The past has many shadows, and together we can keep holding up the light. Sleep well, and remember, history whispers, even when we try not to hear it.